A biological weapon detonates over a major metropolis. The cinematic skyline burns, crowds panic, and martial law is declared. You saw this exact sequence in a blockbuster theater exactly 36 months before a real-world parallel brought the globe to a standstill. But this was not a prophecy. A Declassified Freedom of Information Act release slides across the screen. The document bears the film's title, stamped and authorized by a Department of Defense liaison. There is no magic here, only bureaucracy. Your visceral reaction to modern crises, the sudden spike in anxiety, the immediate, unquestioning acceptance of sweeping new security protocols, feels entirely organic. It is not. That exact emotional sequence was focus grouped, refined, and installed directly into your subconscious 42 months earlier while you were eating popcorn in the dark. If you do not understand this mechanical process, your entire perception of reality is currently being authored by a psychological operations officer. We are going to bypass the paranoid noise of internet forums and rely strictly on the archive. We will follow the paper trail, the metadata, and the authorized transactions. Through the cold lens of an investigator, we will map the precise, documented pipeline that connects a classified Pentagon threat assessment directly to a Hollywood script. We will lay out the evidence proving exactly how your mind is primed and conditioned for the next engineered global catastrophe. A harsh halogen desk lamp cuts through the gloom of the windowless reading room at the National Archives. Gloved hands carefully turn the brittle pages of an original, production-used shooting script from a massive 1990s blockbuster. To the intelligence archivist, this is a crime scene. Beneath the glare of the bulb, entire paragraphs of civilian dialogue are viciously crossed out in heavy red ink. In the margins, someone has meticulously rewritten the scenes using precise, militaristic jargon. Resting like a paperweight on the final act of this cinematic masterpiece is a heavy bronze military challenge coin. The archivist does not see artistic collaboration here. They see a compromised asset. For decades, the public believed government interference in mass media was a fringe theory, a phantom menace. But the documents stacked in this temperature-controlled room strip away the myth. We are looking at a documented, standardized institutional procedure, logged in triplicate. The scale of the operation is staggering, hidden purely by its sheer volume. Between 1911 and 2017, the United States Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency quietly intervened in over 800 major motion pictures. The paper trail extends further, wrapping its fingers around more than 1,000 television titles. This is not casual consultation. This is the systemic restructuring of global cultural narratives from behind a classified curtain. Scanning through the microfiche, the archivist correlates release dates with geopolitical policy shifts. Every time the public needed to support a new foreign intervention, a perfectly timed cinematic release preemptively justified the aggression. The studios provided the emotional delivery system, and the state provided the authorized narrative payload. The evidence is overwhelming. The most beloved cultural touchstones of the 20th century were heavily edited by active-duty intelligence officers. The mechanism driving this psychological operation is practically an open secret in the industry. It centers around a highly specialized, obscure bureaucracy known as the Entertainment Media Office. This department offers film studios an irresistible proposition: heavily subsidized, almost unlimited access to otherwise restricted military assets. They provide nuclear aircraft carriers, elite active-duty personnel, and state-of-the-art fighter jets at a fraction of their actual operational cost. But this unprecedented access comes with a rigid, non-negotiable contract. In exchange for the hardware, the Entertainment Media Office demands total narrative leverage. The studio must submit to a grueling, line-by-line script review by military liaisons. The archivist traces the red lines across multiple drafts, noting a distinct pattern. Any dialogue, character arc, or plot point that does not align perfectly with the strategic objectives of the Pentagon is ruthlessly excised from the final cut. The leverage applied to the directors is brutally simple and entirely financial. If a script dares to portray a systemic failure of the government or questions the morality of the intelligence apparatus, the Pentagon simply denies access. Instantly, the studio is forced to absorb millions of dollars in unexpected budget overages to digitally recreate the denied assets. In the cutthroat margins of Hollywood, that kind of financial penalty is an absolute death sentence for a sprawling production. This ruthless financial imperative fundamentally alters the psychology of the screenwriters before they even hit the first keystroke. Knowing that a critical script will bankrupt the project, writers instinctively begin to self-censor. They engineer their plots to appease the invisible censors in Washington. The archivist recognizes this as a hostile corporate takeover of the creative process. The state does not need to explicitly ban dissent. They simply price it completely out of the market. We are examining an airtight system of control masquerading as free market entertainment. The beneficiaries of this transaction are perfectly aligned. The studio gets a breathtaking visual spectacle that guarantees a massive opening weekend at the box office. The defense apparatus gets a 2-hour, globally distributed commercial for their technological supremacy, effectively recruiting the next generation of soldiers without spending a single dollar from their official advertising budget. Every blockbuster you have ever consumed must be reevaluated as a potential vector for cognitive conditioning. The paper trail we are analyzing today proves that the line separating fictional cinema from authorized state propaganda was erased decades ago. The investigator's ledger shows no distinction between a military deployment and a movie premiere. Both are calculated operations designed to secure specific strategic objectives. The only difference is the theater of operation. This meticulously documented relationship exposes the foundational law of predictive programming. It is not some grand mystical conspiracy cooked up in a smoky back room. It is a simple, brutal transaction encoded directly into the production budget. The archivist circles a line item on a declassified invoice. It all distills down to the oldest motive in the investigator's handbook: a flawless, legally binding quid pro quo between the people who write the laws and the people who write the lines. The economics of mass persuasion are terrifyingly efficient. Ask yourself the central question that drives this entire covert pipeline. Why would a Hollywood producer pay $10,000 a day to rent a replica tank when the military will deliver a real one to the set entirely for free? The only currency required is total script approval. The hardware is complementary. The true price of admission is the surrender of your independent reality. We just need to follow the ink. We just need to follow the ink. But once that ink dries on a legally binding contract, what exactly happens to the narrative? The transaction leaves the accounting department and enters a sterile, windowless screening room deep inside the Pentagon. The projector beam cuts through the suspended dust, casting a montage of engineered doom onto the wall. A cyber attack blacking out Manhattan. A rogue artificial intelligence seizing the grid. A viral pathogen emptying the streets. Through the lens of an investigator, the most chilling detail in this room is not the apocalyptic footage. It is the empty leather chair of the chief liaison officer. This individual does not write dialogue. They do not direct actors. Yet they possess absolute veto power over your nightmares. Here, we confront a statistical anomaly that defies coincidence. Hollywood blockbusters consistently, almost supernaturally, broadcast the exact specifics of global crises years before they detonate. I have spent years tracking these paper trails, and the conclusion is brutally pragmatic. The screenwriters predicting our doom are not clairvoyant. They do not possess a magical crystal ball. They are simply reading the exact same unclassified threat assessments generated by the intelligence community. The prophecy is a bureaucratic echo. We're looking at a closed-loop system, where the architect of the crisis also provides the blueprint for the cinematic distraction. The evidence is buried in the archives of institutional wargaming. Long before a script is pitched to a studio executive, defense agencies are running multi-billion-dollar simulations. They mathematically model structural collapses, supply chain failures, and biological outbreaks 10 to 20 years into the future. These predictive models are scrubbed of classified operational data, bound into sterile white papers, and quietly released into the public domain. These unclassified documents become the foundational research material for Hollywood creatives desperate for a realistic thriller plot. A screenwriter looking for authenticity does not need to invent a cybersecurity protocol. They simply download a Pentagon wargame summary. The intelligence apparatus provides the highly detailed scaffolding of the apocalypse entirely free of charge. The studio merely hires attractive actors to run screaming through the predetermined simulation. But why would the state freely distribute its proprietary disaster scenarios to the entertainment industry? The motive is a psychological exploit. By actively authorizing these specific, highly catastrophic narratives for global distribution, the agencies execute a calculated protocol. The official designation for this cognitive operation is threat normalization. They are not warning you about the future. They are systematically acclimating your nervous system to the inevitable fallout. This is the core mechanic of predictive programming. The objective is to force the public to digest the visual language of a crisis long before the actual event disrupts their reality. You watch the quarantine zones, the martial law declarations, and the suspension of civil liberties, while sitting comfortably in a theater, eating popcorn. The trauma is simulated, but the neural pathways formed by watching the collapse are incredibly, biologically real. I need you to understand the sheer scale of this psychological operation. This is mass cognitive priming executed with a massive special effects budget. The state understands that a sudden, unprecedented catastrophe triggers unpredictable, chaotic variables in a civilian population. Chaos is the enemy of a managed society. The only way to mitigate that variable is to ensure that the catastrophe, when it finally arrives, does not feel entirely unprecedented. The return on this investment manifests the moment the simulated crisis bleeds into the real world. When the grid actually fails, or the pathogen actually mutates, the meticulously engineered programming activates. The public does not panic uncontrollably. Instead, a strange psychological phenomenon takes hold. The civilian population experiences a bizarre sense of mass familiarity. The shock is instantly cushioned by a pre-installed recognition of the unfolding disaster. Because the visual vocabulary of the event was already consumed as entertainment, the population instinctively defaults to the behavioral scripts they learned from the movie. They know the choreography of a lockdown. They understand the necessity of checkpoints. The cinema taught them exactly how to perform the role of a terrified, compliant citizen. The screenwriters inadvertently drafted the operational manual for mass behavioral compliance. In every authorized disaster film, the narrative arc relentlessly drives toward a single, manufactured conclusion. The panicked masses are utterly helpless until a centralized, militarized authority steps in to restore order. This is the ultimate payload of the psychological hack. You are neurologically trained to associate the suspension of your constitutional rights with survival. The hero of the film is never the individual. The hero is the emergency executive power. Look closely at that dust dancing in the projector beam of this empty Pentagon screening room. Every speck represents a subtle adjustment to your perception of risk and safety. The liaison officer's chair remains empty because the hard work is already done. The psychological perimeter was secured years before the first siren ever sounded in your city. They do not need to deploy troops to control a population that has already surrendered in their own living rooms. The paper trail unequivocally proves that the narrative is manipulated from the top down. But tracing the flow of memos and money only answers half of the investigator's equation. We know exactly what the intelligence apparatus is injecting into the global cultural bloodstream. The terrifying question that remains is why human biology is so profoundly defenseless against it. To find that answer, we must leave the archive and examine the hardwiring of the brain itself. I left the archives because paper trails only expose the supply side of the transaction. To understand the demand, you have to look at the target's hardware. Through the clinical lens of a cognitive psychologist, the human subject sitting in this DARPA-funded laboratory is not watching a movie. They are processing an input sequence. The eye-tracking monitors reflect the glare of a high-tension explosion on the screen. Look at the biometric readouts mapping the subject's baseline reality. We are taught to believe that our political convictions are built on rational analysis and hard facts. Yet the evidence on these screens proves a deeply uncomfortable truth. A 2-hour fictional narrative bypasses your intellectual firewall entirely, altering your foundational beliefs far more effectively than any sterile news report. It is the ultimate cognitive exploit. The vulnerability lies in the architecture of your limbic system, the ancient emotional processor buried deep within your skull. When the test subject watches the protagonist make a fatal sacrifice, the optic nerve transmits a highly realistic, albeit artificial, threat. But the limbic system cannot distinguish between simulated cinematic danger and a genuine physical predator. The biological response is identical. The heat map on the monitor flares crimson. We are witnessing a physiological hijacking in real time. Heart rate spikes to 120 beats per minute. The adrenal glands dump a payload of epinephrine into the bloodstream. The subject is sitting safely in a padded chair, yet their body is preparing for a fight to the death. The fiction has successfully triggered a biological protocol millions of years old. This manufactured emotional arousal is not just for entertainment. It is the biochemical key to rewriting the database. As the adrenaline surges, it is followed by a massive release of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Through the detached eyes of the researcher, this cortisol flood is highly functional. It acts as a solvent, temporarily dissolving the brain's logical defenses and radically increasing neuroplasticity. When the firewall drops, the prefrontal cortex, your center for critical thinking, is effectively taken offline. The ideological messaging hidden within the script no longer has to negotiate with your skepticism. It slips right past the perimeter, embedding the authorized narrative directly into long-term memory. The studio did not just sell you a ticket. They secured root access to your subconscious architecture. Recent neuroimaging studies from 2024 confirm the sheer scale of this intrusion. Functional magnetic resonance imaging scans reveal that during these peak emotional sequences, entire populations experience neural entrainment. Millions of distinct minds synchronize, their brainwaves oscillating at the exact same frequency, dictated by the rhythm of the director's cuts. It is a mass synchronization event. Every micro-expression, every dilated pupil, and every microscopic bead of sweat is quantified. As the subject reacts, the biometric data streams out of the laboratory and into a massive, climate-controlled server farm. This is the telemetry of human vulnerability. The intelligence apparatus is not just broadcasting a signal. They are measuring the exact calibration required to induce widespread, predictable panic. The clinical term for the resulting psychological artifact is the availability heuristic. It is a cognitive blind spot where the human mind calculates the probability of a future event based solely on how easily an image of that event can be recalled. By injecting high-budget visualizations of a viral outbreak or a hijacked airplane into your memory bank, the architects guarantee that those specific images are always accessible. Because the cinematic trauma is so vivid, your brain mathematically overestimates the real-world probability of the threat. The screenwriters have effectively loaded the dice. You walk out of the theater genuinely convinced that society is teetering on the edge of collapse, not because of any statistical reality, but because the fictional evidence was rendered in 4,000 pixel resolution with a surround sound score. This manipulated probability calculus has a direct, measurable impact on the geopolitical chessboard. When a population is artificially convinced that a catastrophe is imminent, their voting behavior radically shifts. The data confirms they become statistically far more likely to demand and support preemptive security measures. They will eagerly hand over their civil liberties in exchange for a phantom sense of safety. Follow the physiological paper trail. The Pentagon liaison approves the script, the studio manufactures the sensory stimuli, and the cortisol forces your neurons to accept the programming. The public assumes they are forming independent political opinions about national security. In reality, they are merely executing a behavioral subroutine that was installed 42 months ago while they were eating buttered popcorn. The architecture of mass consent is not built with legislation or military force. It is built with dopamine and fear. By the time the actual crisis hits the newsfeed, the psychological groundwork is already cemented. The investigators know the human brain is compromised, but to see a true historical anomaly, we must look at a specific case file where they actively erased the truth from a blockbuster to protect their secrets. We understand the psychology of the cognitive exploit. Now let us examine a hard, forensic case study of a hack executed in real time. The evidence is not buried in a secret bunker. It is sitting in the National Archives reading room. Black redaction bars slide across newly declassified Freedom of Information Act responses, locking down paragraphs like jail cell doors closing on the truth. The paper trail is cold, bureaucratic, and undeniable. The archivist's latex-gloved hands trace a specific, highly sensitive email chain originating in the summer of 1996. The target of this federal scrutiny is not a foreign spy ring, but a massive Hollywood blockbuster centered on a fictional alien invasion. To the untrained eye, it is just studio correspondence. But through the lens of the investigator, a glaring anomaly emerges in the margins of the early script draft. Why does the Pentagon care about a script featuring flying saucers and laser beams? Because nestled within the science fiction was a highly inconvenient geopolitical reality. The initial draft featured a critical scene where the lead military hero explicitly mentions the government hiding classified assets at Area 51. It was a throwaway line for the writer, but a catastrophic security breach for the liaison officer reviewing the file. At that precise moment in history, the United States government vehemently denied the very existence of the Nevada testing facility. It was a black site, erased from official maps. Yet here was a studio, preparing to broadcast its name in surround sound to tens of millions of global citizens. The archivist uncovers the immediate, aggressive tactical response from the Department of Defense. They did not ask for a rewrite. They issued an ultimatum. Declassified memos reveal the brutal efficiency of the military's negotiation tactics. The Department of Defense flatly refused any cooperation with the production. They would not provide a single piece of hardware, barring access to all fighter jets, personnel, and military installations. The studio was suddenly facing millions of dollars in catastrophic budget overages. The bureaucracy knew exactly where to apply the financial tourniquet. The terms of surrender were absolute. The military dictated that all dialogue confirming the actual existence of the base must be completely altered. If the facility had to be mentioned for plot purposes, the script demanded it be framed as a ridiculous, paranoid joke. The archivist reads the final approved revision. The studio completely capitulated, trading the truth for subsidized access to a squadron of military fighter jets. This heavily redacted email chain exposes the true dual nature of predictive programming. The mechanism is not just about showing the public what terrifying events are yet to come. It serves a parallel, equally critical function, systematically scrubbing the collective consciousness of what is actually happening right now. It is a real-time sanitization of the present, executed through the mass distribution of high-budget entertainment. Consider the psychological elegance of this operation. By forcing the screenwriter to turn a legitimate, classified military installation into a cinematic punchline, the intelligence apparatus achieved total narrative dominance. They weaponized comedy and fiction against authentic investigative curiosity. When the audience laughed at the eccentric character mentioning the base on screen, their neurochemistry was permanently altered. The viewers unknowingly downloaded a new cognitive defense mechanism. From that premiere onward, whenever the classified facility was brought up in real-world journalistic inquiries, the public instinctively associated the location with absurdity, aliens, and cinematic fiction. The government did not need to silence journalists or deny the rumors. Hollywood had already discredited the entire concept for them, entirely free of charge. To the archivist holding the physical proof, the realization is chilling. This is not censorship in the traditional, authoritarian sense. It is the surgical insertion of a cognitive blind spot. The bureaucracy identified a leak in their operational security and patched it using the very medium the public uses to escape reality. A single line of dialogue was erased, and an entire generation's perception of the Nevada desert was rewritten. This documented case study from 1996 is merely one isolated artifact in a vast, subterranean ecosystem of narrative control. Multiply this single microtransaction of truth across thousands of scripts spanning nearly a century of cinema. The archive surrounding the investigator is not just a repository of old movie trivia. It is a sprawling, meticulously catalogued graveyard of deleted political and historical realities. Every blockbuster that successfully navigates this gauntlet emerges as a carefully sanitized, state-sanctioned product. You are watching the illusion of a free market, while in reality, you are consuming a highly regulated psychological export. The script approval process acts as an invisible filter, ensuring that any concept threatening the established power structure dies on the screenwriter's desk long before the cameras ever start rolling. The military effectively controlled the physical battlefield of cinema, leveraging their hardware to dictate the script. But as the 20th century drew to a close, a new threat emerged. The intelligence apparatus realized that exchanging tanks for dialogue was no longer sufficient. They needed a more sophisticated approach. They needed to stop reacting to the narrative and start engineering it directly from the very first draft. The military controlled the physical hardware, trading tanks for favorable dialogue. But as the Cold War ended, the intelligence apparatus realized that renting out aircraft carriers was a fundamentally reactive strategy. I'm standing on a bustling soundstage in Los Angeles. Thick black power cables snake across the concrete floor like veins feeding a massive, illuminated green screen. The real power here is not the director yelling "cut," but the quiet advisor in civilian clothes whispering into his ear. We pull back, and the studio lighting grid suspended above the set reveals itself not as Hollywood magic, but as a meticulously engineered spiderweb. To the forensic investigator, the paper trail leading to this soundstage is a masterclass in bureaucratic evolution. The intelligence community no longer just wanted to erase inconvenient truths from your Friday night entertainment. They needed to manufacture the ideological foundation of the entire narrative from the very first draft. Look at the geopolitical thrillers of the 1970s. The cultural archetype of the Central Intelligence Agency was the ultimate antagonist. They were depicted as rogue assassins, unaccountable shadow governments, and paranoid wiretappers actively hostile to the public. The agency faced a massive public relations deficit, and internal memos from Langley recognized this cultural hostility as an active threat to their operational funding and domestic authority. This presents a fascinating operational paradox. How do you launder the reputation of an organization fundamentally built on deception and lethal covert action? You do not hold a press conference. You hack the cultural hard drive. You execute a psychological operation not on a foreign adversary, but on the domestic box office. The Langley rebrand was not left to chance. It was a heavily budgeted, meticulously executed offensive maneuver targeting your emotional vulnerabilities. The timeline is exact and fully declassified. In 1996, the agency decided to step out of the shadows of unofficial consulting and build a dedicated pipeline to the screen. They officially hired Chase Brandon, a veteran covert operative with 35 years of clandestine service. But Brandon was not deployed to Moscow or Beijing. His new operational theater was Hollywood, and his official title was the first overt entertainment liaison to the motion picture industry. An active-duty intelligence officer was now stationed inside the Dream Factory, armed with the institutional weight of the federal government. His job was not to advise on uniform accuracy. He was there to rewrite the genetic code of the American protagonist. If this scale of cognitive manipulation blows your mind, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Do you think we ever stood a chance against this machinery? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Brandon's explicit, documented mandate was the total transformation of the agency's public image. He opened the gates of Langley to elite screenwriters and producers, offering unprecedented access to the aesthetic thrill of espionage. In exchange, the narrative transaction was absolute. The rogue assassin archetype was systematically retired. In its place, Brandon helped engineer a new, highly sympathetic character model, the burdened, hyper-competent intelligence analyst. This new protagonist was not a villain, but a misunderstood protector. We began seeing the intelligence officer portrayed as the only rational actor in a chaotic world, the silent guardian making agonizing moral compromises to keep the homeland safe from shadowy, imminent threats. The bureaucracy of espionage was romanticized into a noble sacrifice. You were no longer supposed to fear the wiretapper. You were trained to empathize with the immense stress of his daily workload. I track this archetype shift through the archival data of the early 2000s. The modification of the hero's journey was seamlessly deployed across network television and blockbuster franchises. Every time you rooted for the brilliant analyst racing against a ticking clock, your limbic system was being conditioned to associate federal surveillance with immediate physical safety. The psychological payload was hidden inside the adrenaline spike of the third act. This was not merely brand management. It was strategic sociological preparation. When the catastrophic events of 2001 altered the global landscape, the American public did not fundamentally resist the rapid, unprecedented expansion of the domestic surveillance state. The groundwork had already been laid. The culture had already internalized the absolute necessity of a technologically omnipotent, legally unconstrained intelligence apparatus. Years before the Patriot Act was drafted, you had already voted for its underlying philosophy at the multiplex. The algorithmic predictability of human fear was harvested to manufacture preemptive consent. By the time the government demanded access to your metadata, your biological hardwiring had already been repeatedly subjected to fictional scenarios where withholding that exact data resulted in a catastrophic nuclear detonation in a major metropolitan center. Follow the psychological paper trail. The threat was artificial, the hero was focus grouped, but your spike in cortisol was entirely real. This is the ultimate operational success of the Langley rebrand. They did not just change how you view their agency. They fundamentally altered your baseline calculation of freedom versus security. The intelligence community transformed your television screen into a localized, highly effective pacification device. Standing on this soundstage, looking at the intricate web of lighting cables, the true nature of the operation becomes chillingly clear. They conquered the narrative of the past and the present, but the bureaucratic machinery of Hollywood was just the prototype. As we entered the digital millennium, the analog methods of script approval were about to be weaponized by something far more invasive. They were preparing for an era of invisible, non-state contagions. The rebranding of the intelligence agent was merely the preliminary phase of a much larger psychological operation. As I watch this microscopic pathogen endlessly divide on the illuminated petri dish, the organic geometry mirrors the illuminated grid of the sprawling metropolis below. Phase 2 required preparing your mind not for a foreign military, but for an entirely invisible, non-state threat. The enemy was no longer a uniform. The enemy was the air you breathe. Look at the archival evidence from the major epidemiological thrillers of the last 2 decades. There is a staggering forensic anomaly hidden in plain sight. The cinematic depictions of viral outbreaks eerily and perfectly match the exact civic protocols implemented over a decade later. This is the epidemic dress rehearsal. You are not watching a speculative fiction. You are observing a meticulously engineered input designed to yield a highly specific, measurable output from the population. The paper trail reveals a deliberate symbiosis between the entertainment industry and global health authorities. Declassified production logs show that screenwriters for these contagion thrillers consult heavily with the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization. The resulting scripts are not products of creative imagination. They are gamified versions of unclassified, highly detailed pandemic response protocols, disguised as Friday night entertainment. To the cognitive psychologist analyzing the data, a blockbuster disaster movie is merely a sterile laboratory environment. When the cinematic city lights flicker and die, simulating a total grid collapse on screen, the filmmakers are executing a controlled experiment on your nervous system. They are feeding your brain the exact visual language of a systemic breakdown. The objective is to map out the exact psychological breaking point of a civilian population under acute, invisible stress. By deliberately visualizing draconian lockdowns, mandatory medical quarantines, and the rapid collapse of global supply chains on the silver screen, sociologists gain unprecedented access to human behavioral models. They can analyze the public's visceral, measurable reaction to the film as a sophisticated form of non-invasive mass polling. Every ticket sold, every spike in streaming engagement, provides raw data on how willingly a demographic will surrender civil liberties during a panic. Through comprehensive sentiment analysis of theater audiences across different geographic regions, the intelligence apparatus extracts highly accurate compliance metrics. For instance, internal demographic modeling based on late 2010s disaster films showed that urban populations demonstrated a 62% higher baseline acceptance of martial law narratives compared to rural demographics. Your cinematic terror is carefully quantified, categorized, and filed into a database. This brings us to the ultimate functional purpose of the epidemic thriller. When a real biological crisis finally materializes in the physical world, the target population has already undergone the initial psychological shock phase virtually. Your brain has already processed the trauma within the safe confines of a theater or your living room. The cinematic experience serves as a cognitive inoculant, preemptively neutralizing your natural resistance to sudden extreme shifts in daily life. Because the narrative logic of a quarantine was established in your subconscious years prior, your cognitive defenses are permanently bypassed. You do not question the sudden implementation of sweeping, unprecedented emergency executive powers because the cinematic precedent has already validated their necessity. The government does not need to waste valuable time convincing you to stay inside. Hollywood already successfully negotiated your compliance 42 months before the pathogen mutated. Look closely at the timeline of events. The sheer lack of widespread organized friction during sudden civic shutdowns is the forensic anomaly that proves the success of the operation. In a truly organic society, restricting the movement of millions would trigger immediate, chaotic resistance. Instead, we witnessed a mathematically predictable, synchronized retreat. The population followed the script flawlessly, because the behavioral parameters were already hardwired into their expectations. From the sterile perspective of the behavioral scientist, human emotion is nothing more than a programmable input and output system. We are not dealing with individual free will. We are analyzing aggregate biological responses to engineered stimuli. When you wept for the cinematic protagonist sacrificing themselves to secure a vaccine, your empathy was actively weaponized. You were being trained to view strict, centralized medical authority as the sole mechanism for species survival. The genius of this psychological architecture lies in its utter transparency. There are no covert mind control facilities or shadowy brainwashing chambers required. The entire conditioning process is executed in broad daylight, funded by your own entertainment budget. The intelligence community merely provides the blueprint, and the studio executives finance the cognitive hack. You voluntarily pay for the privilege of having your threat perception meticulously recalibrated by the state. Watch the pathogen divide again under the harsh light of the laboratory microscope. It multiplies with the same cold mathematical efficiency as a subsidized ideological narrative spreading through a global streaming platform. Every new host infected by the virus mirrors every new viewer consuming the disaster film. The contagion and the propaganda utilize the exact same vectors of transmission. They both rely on a dense, highly interconnected network of vulnerable, unsuspecting human nodes. We have established how the broad strokes of societal collapse were painted onto the silver screen to condition the masses. But mass conditioning is an analog tool in a digital world. The broadcast era of predictive programming relied on a shotgun approach, hoping enough of the population absorbed the narrative. The system was effective but inefficient. To achieve total behavioral control, the intelligence apparatus needed a sniper rifle. They needed to know your specific, individualized fear. The broadcast era of predictive programming was a shotgun approach, hoping enough of the population absorbed the narrative. But in 2026, the system uses a sniper rifle. I am standing in a dark server room deep inside the headquarters of a global streaming giant. Blue, light-emitting diode indicators blink rhythmically in the freezing air. Code cascades down a primary monitor, processing millions of user interactions per second. This is the new architecture of fear. The anomaly in the data stream is staring us right in the face. Two different users log into the exact same platform, but their home screens display entirely distinct catalogs of impending doom. The interface is not offering entertainment. It is executing an algorithmic sorting of psychological profiles based on microscopic viewing habits. The code cascading down this screen is narrowing millions of data points down to a single target. That target is you, and the weapon is your own anxiety. Let us examine the forensic evidence of your digital footprint. Modern streaming platforms do not just log the title of the movie you selected. They compile a continuous, biometric-level paper trail of your cognitive friction. They track the exact millisecond you hit pause, the scenes you obsessively rewatch, and the precise moment of tension where you abandon a film. This telemetry generates a high-resolution psychological fingerprint of your specific, individualized anxieties. To the investigator analyzing this server traffic, your profile is an open book of vulnerabilities. In 2023, behavioral psychologists discovered that micro-hesitations during suspense sequences correlate directly with real-world phobias. If you pause a thriller during a biological containment scene, the system flags a pathogen vulnerability. You are unknowingly submitting yourself to a continuous, non-consensual polygraph test every time you press the play button. With the integration of advanced artificial intelligence, this surveillance data dictates an active, dynamic alteration of your content delivery. The algorithm is no longer a passive librarian. It is an active psychological operations officer. If your data fingerprint indicates a high underlying anxiety regarding macroeconomic collapse, the system immediately quarantines your feed. It disproportionately serves you dystopian thrillers featuring hyperinflation, bank runs, and urban riots. You believe you are making an autonomous choice when selecting a film for the evening. The cold reality of the server logs proves otherwise. The artificial intelligence has already calculated that your cortisol levels will spike highest when confronted with financial ruin. By drowning your interface in customized apocalyptic scenarios, the platform ensures your baseline stress regarding the global economy remains artificially elevated. The threat is manufactured, but your panic is entirely real. This is the clinical execution of algorithmic predictive programming. The state no longer needs to rely on a single monolithic blockbuster to condition the entire population. Instead, the architecture isolates the individual in a customized, impenetrable echo chamber of tailored doom. Mass psychological manipulation has transitioned from an unreliable art form into a vastly more efficient, entirely automated mathematical certainty. The bureaucracy of mind control is now self-executing. Follow the transaction logic of this digital infrastructure. Why dedicate billions of dollars in processing power to curate your specific nightmares? Because an individualized fear response yields a highly predictable political compliance. If the algorithm successfully convinces you that a cyber attack on the power grid is imminent, you will, mathematically, support invasive internet surveillance laws. Your tailored trauma is the currency that purchases your future legislative consent. Watch the blue light-emitting diode indicators blink furiously on these server racks. Each flash represents a successful cognitive hack, a moment where a fictional scenario successfully embedded itself into a citizen's threat matrix. This room does not house servers. It houses the digital nervous system of the modern populace. The intelligence apparatus has effectively outsourced its psychological warfare division to the very tech conglomerates that provide your nightly entertainment. The sniper rifle of modern propaganda never misses because it is guided by your own unredacted data trail. By weaponizing your unique psychological vulnerabilities, the state achieves a level of behavioral control that 20th century intelligence officers could only dream of. The Hollywood script approval process merely planted the seed. This automated algorithmic delivery mechanism is the invisible, inescapable greenhouse that forces your engineered anxieties to bloom on command. I am tracking the output of these algorithms, and the paper trail leads directly out of Silicon Valley and into the boardrooms of the military-industrial complex. The optimization of your fear is not just a mechanism for social control. It is a highly lucrative business model. To understand the true scale of this operation, we must step away from the code and examine the corporate ledger. We must identify the financial beneficiaries who profit when your personalized apocalypse goes live. To prove this digital architecture is not merely a rogue algorithm optimizing for engagement, we must abandon the server room and follow the ultimate metric of truth. We must follow the money. Through the glare of the laptop screen in this darkened office, the search operators execute across global financial registries. The digital corkboard begins to populate, drawing lines between seemingly isolated corporate entities. We're no longer looking at code, we're looking at capital. The investigator isolates a glaring structural anomaly in the data. Why does a multinational conglomerate that manufactures precision-guided munitions hold a massive equity stake in a studio known for summer blockbusters? On paper, these two industries possess zero operational overlap. One builds the machinery of kinetic warfare, while the other sells escapism and popcorn. Yet the financial paper trail connecting them is as thick as a phone book, and it demands an immediate explanation. I am pulling the Securities and Exchange Commission filings from the last 2 decades. The transaction history reveals a systemic pattern that defies basic market logic. Hundreds of millions of dollars flow smoothly from the defense sector into the entertainment industrial complex, disguised as subsidiary investments and joint ventures. This is not a series of isolated stock purchases by wealthy executives. This is a deliberate, structural merging of 2 colossal economic engines. A forensic analysis of these corporate governance structures exposes the motive behind the money. Cross-referencing the board of directors for the top 5 defense contractors with the top 5 global media conglomerates reveals an identical roster of names. The chief executive officer approving the manufacture of next-generation drones is sitting at the exact same mahogany table as the studio head greenlighting a dystopian thriller about a devastating, unchecked artificial intelligence. Through the lens of the investigator, this shared boardroom is not a conflict of interest. It is a highly efficient, strategic alignment. The executives do not need to explicitly order the screenwriters to draft propaganda. The control mechanism is purely financial. By dominating the board, they control the production budgets, the marketing spend, and the executive bonuses. They ensure that only narratives beneficial to the military-industrial complex ever survive the development phase. This incestuous corporate governance creates a perfectly sealed, closed-loop economic ecosystem. Look at the ledger. The defense industry requires perpetual, simmering geopolitical tension to justify its annual trillion-dollar budgets to the legislature. Without the constant, looming specter of a catastrophic threat, the demand for their hardware plummets. They cannot openly lobby for war without facing public backlash, so they outsource the manufacturing of that necessary tension entirely. The media conglomerates fulfill this demand by manufacturing high-fidelity apocalyptic entertainment. They act as the public relations wing for the defense contractors, translating abstract geopolitical risks into visceral, terrifying visual narratives. When you sit in the theater and watch a foreign superpower launch a cyber attack on the electric grid, you are consuming an advertisement for increased defense spending. The studio monetizes your fear, and the contractor monetizes the solution. You might be tempted to label this a shadow conspiracy, a cabal of men smoking cigars in a subterranean bunker. But the investigator's evidence points to something far more mundane and entirely legal. It is a legally mandated fiduciary duty. Under corporate law, these executives are strictly obligated to maximize shareholder value. If synchronizing public fear with defense spending guarantees a quarter-over-quarter return on investment, failing to do so would be a breach of their contract. This is the true horror of the paper trail. There is no sinister plot hidden in the dark web. The evidence is publicly filed in annual shareholder reports. The systemic conditioning of your mind is simply the most reliable business model available to institutional investors. The architects of this system do not necessarily care about ideology or nationalism. They care about the quarterly earnings report. Your induced panic is merely a raw material, harvested to inflate stock valuations. As my fingers fly across the keyboard, connecting the final shell company to its ultimate beneficiary, the digital corkboard forms a perfect circle. The money flows from the taxpayer into the defense budget, through the media conglomerate, and back into the pockets of the institutional shareholders. The only product generated by this trillion-dollar cycle is a psychological state, a populace permanently convinced that the end of the world is always exactly one news cycle away. This boardroom overlap guarantees that the script for our collective future will always be written by the very entities that profit from our destruction. They do not just predict the future. They budget for it, cast it, and release it into the cultural bloodstream. The algorithmic sniper rifle isolating you in an echo chamber is merely the final distribution network. The source code of your anxiety is drafted here, at the intersection of Hollywood, where fiction and foreign policy become one. The digital corkboard of defense contracts finally leads us out of the boardroom and into the dark. I am looking down at a massive, crowded movie theater. The cold light from the projector washes over hundreds of faces. Their expressions are uniform, slack-jawed, dilated pupils, entirely captivated by the artificial crisis. We've traced the paper trail from the Pentagon desk to the streaming algorithm, but this is the final destination. The human mind is the ultimate, undeniable target. From this vantage point, the theater screen looks like a tiny, glowing microchip embedded in the vast darkness of the city. We began this investigation by asking how Hollywood predicts the future, looking for a shadow conspiracy. Now, the verdict is irrefutable. There is no magic, only a heavily subsidized, bureaucratic protocol. We thought we were the consumers of entertainment, buying an escape from reality. Instead, we are the raw material being actively processed and programmed. This is the final draft of the geopolitical script, and it exposes a brilliant, cynical scheme. Predictive programming is the ultimate triumph of the modern intelligence apparatus. By outsourcing their psychological operations directly to the entertainment sector, the state achieves the impossible. They do not just manufacture a propaganda narrative. They actually force you to pay $15 a ticket to sit in the dark and be actively conditioned against your own cognitive autonomy. Our case file is now complete. We have seen how the military trades aircraft carriers for line-by-line script approval, effectively erasing their own secrets from the public record. We watched the Central Intelligence Agency rebrand its cultural archetype, preparing the citizenry for an omnipresent surveillance state. We documented how pandemic thrillers operate as non-invasive mass polling, inoculating society against the shock of future lockdowns and emergency executive powers. Every frame of these subsidized blockbusters was engineered to trigger your limbic system. By flooding your brain with cortisol through a simulated crisis, the screenwriters bypassed your logical defenses, implanting ideological messaging directly into your long-term memory. You are not watching the movie is programming you. It creates an availability heuristic so powerful that when a real crisis strikes, you instinctively demand the very security state you were trained to trust. The tragedies of tomorrow are being focus grouped today in editing bays 3,000 miles away from Washington. The scheme is entirely automated now. Artificial intelligence isolates you in an echo chamber, analyzing your data to feed you customized thrillers that perfectly match your deepest anxieties. When the next unprecedented global event occurs, pay close attention to the visual language the media uses. You will find the script was approved and finalized a decade ago. The illusion of the free market has been entirely dispelled. We are living inside a closed-loop economic ecosystem where defense contractors and media conglomerates synchronize our panic to maximize shareholder value. True intellectual freedom in 2026 requires a radical acceptance of this reality. You must realize that your own imagination has been systematically weaponized against you. You must become the lead forensic investigator of your own deepest fears. The dossier is officially open, but this investigation does not end when the screen goes black. If this evidence has dismantled the way you perceive modern media, subscribe to the channel to continue this forensic research with us. Go to the comments right now and log the exact movie that you now realize was preparing you for a real-world crisis. We are crowdsourcing the next phase of this audit, and your cognitive fingerprint is the most critical piece of evidence we have left. The architecture of mass consent relies entirely on your passive participation in the dark. But once you identify the bureaucratic machinery operating behind the projection booth, the cognitive hack loses its power over your mind. The geopolitical script for the future is still being written, and it is time we finally refuse to play our assigned roles. The investigation is complete, and this case file is officially closed. Signing off.